The moment I understood I was wasting my life wasn't loud. It didn't come with tears or panic or a dramatic collapse. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, when nothing was wrong, and that terrified me more than any crisis ever had. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a screen I had stared at for years, doing work I knew how to do without thinking. My hands moved automatically. My face wore the expression I had practiced for so long it felt natural. And suddenly a thought crossed my mind, simple and devastating: I could do this for the rest of my life and never feel alive again. What scared me wasn't that the thought felt dark. It was that it felt calm. I had built a life that worked. That was the word everyone used: worked. It paid the bills. It kept people satisfied. It didn't attract questions or concern. From the outside, it looked responsible, even successful. From the inside, it felt like slow erosion. Like something essential was being worn away day after day, quietly, patiently. I told myself this was adulthood. That everyone feels like this eventually. That expecting fulfillment was childish, unrealistic, selfish. I repeated these thoughts so often they became part of my internal language. They kept me in place. They explained away the emptiness. They turned my discomfort into something noble: endurance. But endurance has a limit. I began to notice how carefully I avoided silence. The moment there was nothing demanding my attention, the unease surfaced. So I filled my days with noise. Work. Screens. Conversations that never went deep enough to touch anything real. At night, I fell asleep exhausted, not from effort, but from avoidance. The worst part was that nothing was technically wrong. No disaster. No abuse. No obvious reason to leave. And because of that, I felt trapped by my own logic. How do you justify walking away from a life that looks fine? How do you explain that you're suffocating when the air seems breathable to everyone else? I stayed because staying was defensible. I stayed because leaving would require answers I didn't have. It would mean disappointing people who had invested in the version of me they understood. It would mean admitting that the choices I had made carefully, responsibly had led me somewhere I didn't want to be. That admission felt like failure. So I adapted instead. I learned to shrink my expectations. To lower the volume on my desires. I told myself I didn't want much anyway. That wanting more was the problem, not the life I was living. Slowly, without noticing, I stopped imagining a future that felt different from my present. That's when time became dangerous. Years passed without clear markers. Everything blended together. The same weeks, the same conversations, the same reassurances. I watched my reflection change subtly: more tension around the eyes, less curiosity in the gaze. I was aging without growing. Existing without expanding. Sometimes, late at night, a sense of panic would surface. A sudden awareness that this was not temporary. That no invisible force was coming to interrupt my routine and redirect me. The life I was living was the life I was choosing, every single day, by not choosing otherwise. That realization came with guilt. Guilt for being ungrateful. Guilt for wanting more when others had less. Guilt for feeling empty in a life that looked complete. I judged myself harshly for my dissatisfaction. I tried to reason it away. But emotions don't respond to logic the way we want them to. They wait. And then they return, stronger. The truth I avoided was simple and unbearable: I wasn't afraid of losing what I had. I was afraid of discovering who I would be without it. My identity was tied to familiarity. To predictability. To being the person who stayed, who endured, who didn't disrupt. Leaving felt like stepping into nothing. One evening, I stood in my kitchen, lights off, listening to the hum of appliances, and it hit me with brutal clarity: if I don't leave this life, I will disappear inside it. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But slowly enough that no one would notice until it was too late, maybe not even me. That was the first time I allowed myself to think of escape not as betrayal, but as survival. I didn't act on it. Not yet. But something inside me had shifted. The familiarity that once comforted me began to feel suffocating. The routines that once protected me started to feel like walls. And for the first time, staying no longer felt like the safer choice. It felt like the risk. After that night, I started living with a secret. Nothing changed on the surface, but everything changed underneath. It was like carrying a second life inside me, one made of thoughts I never voiced and decisions I hadn't yet made. I became hyper-aware of my days. I noticed how often I checked the time, not because I was late, but because I wanted the day to be over. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind did, the tightness in my chest on Sunday evenings, the heaviness in my limbs every morning, the strange relief I felt when plans were cancelled. My body knew before I allowed myself to admit it. I was done. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt immoral. Because walking away from something that wasn't broken felt like ingratitude. Because I had been taught, subtly but persistently, that stability was a virtue and restlessness was a flaw. People admired my consistency. They trusted me. I was reliable. Predictable. Safe. And I hated how much that mattered to me. I tried to talk myself out of the feeling. I told myself I was just tired. Burned out. That a vacation would fix it. That changing my routine would be enough. I made small adjustments, new habits, new goals, shallow promises to myself about eventually. But every attempt felt cosmetic, like rearranging furniture in a house I no longer wanted to live in. The internal conflict grew sharper. On one side was responsibility. The voice that reminded me of everything I would disrupt if I left. The disappointment. The confusion. The practical consequences. That voice was calm, rational, convincing. It spoke in facts and obligations. It told me I was lucky. That many people would trade places with me without hesitation. On the other side was something quieter but more persistent. A voice that didn't argue or explain. It just asked the same question over and over: how long are you willing to disappear? That question followed me everywhere. At work. In conversations. In moments that were supposed to be enjoyable. I felt like an actor who had forgotten why they were on stage but kept performing anyway, afraid to break character. I smiled at the right moments. I said the expected things. But inside, I was counting exits. What scared me most was how normal everything felt. There was no dramatic suffering to justify my urge to leave. No clear villain. No obvious crisis. Just a slow, relentless sense of misalignment. Like wearing clothes that technically fit but never felt right, no matter how long you wore them. I began to imagine alternate versions of my life. Not fantasies of success or reinvention, just simpler things. Waking up without dread. Feeling present in my own body. Making decisions because they felt true, not because they were safe. Those imagined moments felt more real than my actual days. The guilt intensified. I told myself I was selfish. Weak. Unstable. I accused myself of romanticizing escape, of wanting drama where none existed. But the accusations didn't stop the feeling. They only taught me how deeply I had learned to invalidate myself. One night, the pressure became unbearable. I was alone, sitting in silence, when a thought surfaced with terrifying clarity: if you stay, this is your life forever. Not 5 more years. Not until something changes. Forever. The same rhythms. The same compromises. The same quiet erosion. That thought didn't scare me because it was uncertain. It scared me because it was predictable. For the first time, staying felt like the irreversible choice. I realized then that I had been framing the decision wrong all along. I had been asking whether leaving was justified. Whether it made sense. whether it could be explained. But the real question was simpler and harder: can I live honestly if I stay? And the answer was no. That answer came with grief. Real grief. For the life I had invested in. For the relationships shaped by the version of me I was about to abandon. For the certainty I would lose. Choosing myself meant accepting that I would be misunderstood. Possibly resented. Definitely judged. I didn't feel brave. I felt small. Terrified. Alone. But beneath the fear was something steady. A quiet resolve I hadn't felt before. Not excitement. Not relief. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't shout but refuses to leave. I started preparing in silence. Not practically, emotionally. I began detaching from the idea that I owed everyone an explanation that would make my choice acceptable. I practiced sitting with discomfort instead of numbing it. I allowed myself to imagine being the person who leaves, not as a villain, but as someone who finally stops lying. The moral dilemma didn't disappear. It deepened. Was it ethical to prioritize my inner truth over the stability of others? Was authenticity worth the collateral damage? I still don't have perfect answers. But I understood something crucial: staying out of fear was not a moral high ground. It was just fear dressed up as virtue. The decision formed slowly, painfully, without drama. I didn't announce it. I didn't seek permission. I just reached a point where continuing felt like a greater betrayal than leaving. And once I crossed that line internally, there was no way back. Because when you finally admit that a life is killing you quietly, the most dangerous thing you can do is stay loyal to it. I didn't leave with confidence. I left with trembling hands and a chest full of doubt. There was no perfect timing. No sign from the universe. Just a moment when staying felt heavier than any consequence of leaving. I remember standing still, realizing that if I waited to feel ready, I would die exactly where I was, emotionally intact on the outside, completely hollow inside. So I left quietly. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to turn my truth into a debate. I knew that if I tried to explain myself, I would soften the words, shrink the reality, make myself easier to accept. And that was the version of me I was trying to stop being. Walking away felt unreal. The world didn't pause. No one stopped me. The life I had built continued functioning without me, as if my presence had never been essential. That realization hurt more than I expected and freed me more than anything ever had. The first days were brutal. Freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Without routines and roles, there was nothing to hide behind. My thoughts were loud. Regret surfaced in waves. I questioned myself constantly. Had I mistaken fear for truth? Had I abandoned something that could have been enough if I had just tried harder? Loneliness has a way of weaponizing doubt. There were nights when I almost went back. Not because I believed staying was right, but because familiarity is seductive. Familiar pain feels safer than uncertain growth. I understood then why so many people stay where they are, dying not because they don't know, but because they are exhausted by the idea of becoming someone new. Slowly, something shifted. I began to feel again. Not joy, not at first. But clarity. The kind that comes from alignment, not comfort. My days stopped blurring together. Time regained texture. Moments felt distinct. Even sadness felt cleaner, more honest, less numbing. I started listening to myself without immediately correcting or dismissing what I heard. I asked different questions now. Not what will people think, but what can I live with? The answers were quieter, less dramatic, but they felt true. I thought often about the people I left behind. The confusion. The silence. The pain my absence created. I don't deny it. Choosing yourself does not absolve you of the harm caused along the way. Growth is not clean. It is complicated. It leaves marks. But I also understood something I had never allowed myself to believe: staying would have caused harm too, just slower, quieter, and mostly to myself. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing you betrayed yourself for years out of fear of disappointing others. That grief doesn't vanish when you leave. You carry it with you. You learn from it. You let it shape better choices instead of repeating old ones. I didn't reinvent my life overnight. I didn't become fearless or extraordinary. I became present. And presence, I learned, is not loud. It's subtle. It's the absence of constant self-betrayal. It's waking up without immediately bracing for the day. For the first time, my life felt like something I was participating in, not enduring. If you're listening to this and feeling that quiet recognition, that sense that you are surviving a life that no longer fits, I want to tell you what to do. I want to romanticize leaving or demonize staying. But I will tell you this, neutrality is an illusion. Every day you stay is a choice. Every day you leave yourself behind has a cost. I stayed where I was dying because it was familiar. I left because familiarity was no longer worth the price. And if there is one truth I can leave you with, it's this: you don't need a dramatic reason to start over. You only need the honesty to admit that you are disappearing and the courage to stop. I didn't leave to escape my life. I left to finally live inside it.